All right, today we're going to talk about some of the ways that you're robbing yourself of gaming performance. We're talking about free performance, something you've probably already paid for having your system and are probably not having it set up quite properly, or there's just ways that you're not optimizing your system to get the most out of your gaming rigs. Oftentimes, by going through some of the methods we're going to talk about today, we've actually seen gaming performance jump up almost an entire tier of GPU just because of the inefficiencies found in their system. So today we're going to talk about things that you can do to stop robbing your system of performance that you've already paid for. Be Quiet is proud to introduce their all-new light mount and dark mount ultra-silent mechanical keyboards. Optimized for an ultra-quiet typing experience with factory-lubricated silent linear or tactile switches and 3 separate layers of sound dampening. Light mount features a full-size keyboard with an aluminum media wheel and 5 macro keys for streamlined access, while dark mount provides a more modular keyboard with hot-swappable numpad and media dock. Both feature sleek aesthetics, hot-swappable switches, ARGB lighting, and a magnetic palm rest, and are the perfect choice for those who demand comfort, customization, and silence. For more details, visit the sponsored link in the description below. So these are in no particular order. Basically, I've got like the 5 top ways I think that you guys can get more performance out of your system. And then we've got a kind of a bonus mention here for more advanced users. If you're an advanced user, these have probably already been handled in your system, but it's still worth talking about. The first and foremost is the low-hanging fruit. The easiest way to make sure you are optimizing your system is by enabling your XMP and Expo. You cannot talk about this subject without talking about that every single time. Because to this day, people still have memory in their systems that are not running anywhere near their advertised speeds because of the fact they're not even aware that by just plopping the memory in your system and turning it on does not actually enable XMP and Expo. Now, XMP stands for Extreme Memory Profile, which is actually an Intel spec. However, with the popularity of Ryzen-based systems and AMD getting more market share when it comes to the CPU, a lot of AMD motherboards and manufacturers have now started validating AMD CPUs on XMP profiles as well. Now, you also have Expo, which is a specific memory profile that is tailored specifically to AMD and AM5. Now, if you're on a pre-AM5 system like AM4 or any of the older Ryzen CPUs, that would be called DOCP. DOCP was kind of like a more band-aid between saying, okay, we've taken XMP kits and we've validated them to run on AMD, maybe with some tweaked timings, maybe with some slightly different mega transfer speeds. However, they will work. Whereas AM5's Expo is a lot nicer because it's actually built from the ground up to work on AMD in the way that it's intended to. Now, to do this, you got to go into your BIOS, and that's scary for a lot of beginners. Obviously, I'm talking to beginners here because only a beginner would probably have their system memory not running at its maximum speeds. But I still advise all of you to go into your BIOS and at least check, or if you're afraid to go into your BIOS, just go into your Windows Performance tab and then go into the memory and then see what it's actually running at right there, built into Windows. You don't even have to install another utility. Because oftentimes after some Windows updates or some failed restarts, let's say you had a weird power cycle or something and your system didn't boot right and went into system check, oftentimes the BIOS for ultimate stability, if the system did crash, will revert XMP and Expo profiles back to the base clock, which is about 4800 megahertz on DDR5, and then not re-enable itself. So there's been plenty of times where I've actually been caught with that going, oh, I didn't realize it reverted itself because we were dealing with some overclocks on the CPU and whatnot that were not stable. And part of the revert process is to go back to load system defaults, which it'll do automatically sometimes without telling you. And then you're sitting there with RAM that's running under what you paid for. If you're gonna buy 6,000 megahertz or more RAM and you're only gonna run it at 4800, why would you pay the premium for having fast 6,000 megahertz RAM? Now here's the thing. XMP and Expo are not guaranteed to run on your system. They are overclocks. They are overclocks of the memory controller, specifically on the CPU, and the handler on the motherboard. So you might find that you enable XMP or Expo and your system starts boot looping. Then you're having to clear your CMOS to get everything to run again. That doesn't mean you can't still take advantage of faster than stock speeds. Because it is an overclock, not all CPUs can handle the stress of the extra stress on the memory controller. So what I recommend doing is enabling the XMP profile. It'll automatically tell you what the new speed is. So let's say, for instance, you enable the XMP, it's a 6600 megatransfers kit. If you enable 6600 megatransfers and it won't boot, clear your CMOS, go back into the BIOS, re-enable XMP/Expo, and then manually set the speed from 66, maybe down to 64. If that works, run your system, play your games, do some stress tests, and if you don't get any weird crashes or way errors, WHEA, not WAY, then you're probably stable enough. If you start getting weird random blue screens that you can't quite explain, your RAM is probably still not stable, or at least your CPU memory controller is not stable. Drop it down another 200 megahertz and continue that 200 megahertz increment drop until you find full stability. You may not get the full speed you paid for, but you're getting more than letting it run at base. And that works for both Intel and AMD. Now, we also know that if you're running a high-end graphics card or anything that can push a lot of frames per second, having the fastest mega transfers is going to benefit you depending on the games and resolution. So you are just leaving performance on the table if you're not getting your RAM running as fast as it possibly can. Speaking of system crashes, that one just did. So
The irony.
I'll be right back. Now that transition ironically brings us into maximizing and optimizing your GPU's fan curve, which was not what was happening on that system over there. That's an old EVGA card that only has the fan curve working with precision running. And the weird nuance with that one is only one fan works if precision isn't on. And so two of the fans weren't turning on and it throttled itself to shut down. So you guys saw in real time as it was trying to bring itself back to life. The fact that the FPS was dropping a lot because of the fact that it had to keep dropping the frequency to keep itself from melting to death. So that brings us into optimizing your fan curves for your GPU specifically and your CPU as well. Now GPUs from every manufacturer are optimized for acoustics over cooling. Oftentimes, if you were to say take any of your graphics cards right now, doesn't matter if it's AMD or an NVIDIA card, even Intel cards, and put them on in your test bench or in your system, load up something like Heaven or any other kind of a looping benchmark stress test and watch your fan curves. You'll see they more often than not will not go any higher than about 60, maybe 65%. That means there's 35% extra fan RPM available to you to help keep things as cool as possible. Now you might be asking yourself, well, why do I want it to be as cool as possible? Well, that's because all modern GPUs run some sort of a boost logic. And what that means is as the temperatures are lower, the frequencies can stay higher. It's all about this Venn diagram of power draw versus frequency curve versus temperature, and all three of those interrelate so that if any of those have available headroom to them, they can go higher. Frequency and temperature are directly linked with each other. And with modern NVIDIA cards, you start to lose boost bins as low as 45C. In most games, the second you load them, your graphics card goes higher than 45C. Now, modern NVIDIA graphics cards have a boost table that's every 15 megahertz. So after a while, you can actually lose as much as 100, 150, maybe 200 megahertz of overall performance. And with a modern NVIDIA graphics card, that's up to 10% of the actual frequency available to you. And 10% of your reduced frequency, believe it or not, does equate to just about 10% reduced frames per second. So it's actually a very linear curve when it comes to frequency percentage versus FPS. You lose 10% of your frequency, you lose close to 10% of your FPS. So there's a lot of performance left on the table just out of the box when it comes to GPUs, unless they're a giant, beefy, overbuilt cooler. Even then, they're probably gonna run even more silent than the smaller coolers, which have to keep more fan RPM to keep them cool. You can keep extra frequency binning available to you by just keeping your card as cool as possible. Now, obviously that's only half of the equation because that GPU heat has to go somewhere. If your chassis is not up to the task of exhausting all of that hot air, then it's also gonna start to thermal throttle itself because that hot air is just sitting there soaking into all of the components in your system. Not just the graphics card, but your memory, your motherboard components, your chipset, all of the VRMs, your CPU itself, all of it becomes hugely affected if the air inside of your chassis is not exchanged at a high enough rate to keep it as cool as possible. So sometimes the best thing to do actually to get better GPU performance is potentially add more fans to your system. It may not even have anything to do with your GPU. You could go 100% max fan curve. If your case can't get the hot air out of your system, then it's also gonna start to thermal throttle itself simply because there's gonna be kind of a runaway effect when it comes to the heat. So not only optimize your GPU fan curve to get yourself the best performance when it comes to your GPU, without even touching the frequency curve, make sure that your system can get that heat out of the system as fast as possible. So use a piece of software I love. I've done videos about it many times. It's called Fan Control. Now, I've had a lot of people message me and say, Jay, did you know that the fan control software is showing up as a virus? Well, that's actually because of the known WinRing 0 driver problem that was actually now identified as kind of an exploit, if you will. And all the RGB software and fan software and stuff for a lot of companies were based on the weak in the knees peg, if you will, holding up the entire infrastructure of RGB and fan control software known as WinRing 0. So fan control also was utilizing WinRing 0, which is why it was showing up as a virus for a lot of people with their virus software. So I would highly recommend too, having your chassis fans tied to your GPU's temperature. That way, as your GPU temp goes up, the chassis can start to exchange that air quicker. Most of the time when you plug in in fact, just about every time, when you plug your chassis fans into your motherboard, it's only gonna take into account things that are on the motherboard, the CPU, the chipsets, the VRMs, and all that sort of stuff. And in games, we know CPUs are not hit nearly as hard as the GPU itself, because the GPU is handling all of the processing of those frames. Well, that means that your system starts to get warmer because the fans aren't ramping up. The GPU fan starts to ramp up, but all it does is kind of keep it at the hottest temp it's already been at. And then you start to lose your frequency binning because of the fact that your case is not exchanging the air fast enough. So I highly, highly recommend utilizing any piece of software that allows you to tie your fans to GPU performance and CPU performance. No, Fan Control is not endorsing this. It's a free piece of software. I did a whole tutorial on it. We'll try and put a link in the description below so you guys can watch that. But it's cool because you can actually do a dual curve that will allow your fans to respond to what the hottest thing in your system is. So for instance, if you're gaming, then your GPU is going to become the hottest thing in your system. The system fans will start to ramp up to exchange that air as fast as possible, keeping your frequencies as high as possible because the GPU will be as cold as possible. But let's say suddenly now you're doing CPU intensive tasks. Well, now your CPU will be the hottest thing and it will pay attention to the CPU fan curve you have set. So it's awesome because you're not having to pick one thing for it to monitor, which is one of the reasons. Why did that start ramping up? It's all, oh, turn yourself up. And that one just started ramping up. I don't know why. These systems are listening. Anyway, it allows you to make sure that your system is always optimized for whatever is happening inside of it. And that is where so many of these big companies with their control boxes and stuff are really just sort of lacking and falling behind because of the fact that they're not doing that. So anyway, make sure that your curves are optimized specifically when it comes to fans. And guess what? If you optimize those fan curves, more often than not, you can use something like Afterburner or GPU Tweak or GPU whatever software comes with your graphics cards to start to be able to bump up those frequencies a little more and get more free performance with no additional heat. So that's one that a lot of beginners really seem to forget about, is maximizing their curves. A lot of people like to just plop it in, turn it on, and forget it. Well, that's the best way to make sure you are getting the minimum amount of performance you paid for. Now, a couple things to mention before we move on to the next topic. The reason why the CPU fans ramped up over there was because an update or something must have been happening in the background, which hit the CPU. So the system fans ramped up. You may not have even heard it because my mic is on this side of me, but that's a perfect example. The GPU's been running this entire time, but the system fans did nothing because it's tied to the CPU. So until the CPU did something, those fans didn't ramp up, which means right now we're not exchanging the air as efficiently as we could for our GPU. And if you're like me and I'm gaming, I'm either gonna have headphones on or a loud game or something happening, which means I don't mind letting the system get a bit louder. So I would personally prefer to tune my system for best performance with acoustics secondary. Doesn't mean I would just take the fans and max them out 100%. But I would at least make sure that I'm getting performance over acoustics when it comes to gaming systems. Now, another thing to mention too, if you're gonna use Afterburner and ramp up the fans, you got everything as nice and cool as possible, you might as well just maximize that power slider available to you as well, especially on NVIDIA graphics cards, because that's just gonna allow you to be able to keep those frequencies as high as possible. Because now if you've got your temperature as low as possible and your frequency as high as possible, the only other factor there that's gonna limit whether or not your frequency drops is whether or not you've now hit a power limit. So if you increase that power limit 5%, 10%, 15%, etc., it's not gonna make your frequency go necessarily higher, but it's gonna allow it to stay at its max frequency longer. This one here is gonna be kind of a quick topic. This is more specifically directed for anyone that is running any sort of asymmetrical CPU. Obviously, Intel has been running asymmetrical CPUs since 12th gen. We've got E-cores and P-cores. AMD has been running asymmetrical CPUs ever since the multi-CCD Extra D CPUs came out. That's where you have a high frequency die and you have a high cache die. As you know, the Extra D CPUs have become extremely popular. And that is gonna be having an improper Windows power profile set. That's hard to say. A Windows PP power profile. Your Windows PP must be set properly. Is your PP powerful enough?
So mature.
Okay. If you're running specifically 7950 X3D, 7900 X3D, 9950 X3D, and 9900 X3D, you do not want your Windows power profile set to prefer maximum performance. Let me tell you why. I guess 9900X3D and 9900X are kind of separate on this one. That is because prefer maximum performance when it comes to the lassoing of the processes, if you will, and lassoing of the CPUs and the affinity is gonna say, okay, let's always prefer max performance, which in the eyes of Windows is what is the highest frequency available to us. Now, if you're running an asymmetrical CPU like the X3D multi-CCD CPUs, the cache CPU die is always gonna be a lower frequency than the frequency die. And that's by design, because games don't need the max frequency, but that cache is huge when it comes to game performance. But what will happen to the scheduler is if you set Windows prefer maximum performance, is it's very likely going to take your game process and throw it on the higher frequency die, which is actually going to lower your overall gaming performance regardless of the resolution and regardless of the graphics card that you are using. If you paid for the X3D, make sure you are using the X3D. Now, this does not apply to people that are running single CCD X3D CPUs like the 9800 X3D, 7800 X3D, 5800 X3D, 7600 X3D, any of those, because there's only one die. Just make sure if you're running an asymmetrical X3D CPU with multiple CCDs, you do not want prefer maximum performance. On Intel, it's not quite as bad because it's smart enough to know that the performance die is always going to be the preferred die. So if you enable max performance, then what's going to happen is it's obviously going to put the games on the P cores, or the P die, I almost called it, the P cores as often as possible. Now, on the flip side, if you were to put it in an eco mode or like total low power setting, there's a chance it could take your games and throw them on only the E cores, which is very rare, but it has happened, and you want to make sure you're not doing that. So it's kind of like the reverse opposite end of the spectrum, where if you have it set to too efficient, then you rob yourself of performance, because although an army of E-cores do a really good job with games, they are not equipped to handle the task by itself. You want the P-cores obviously being very active, because we don't want those P-cores deactivated in games. Another mention when it comes to games, this is why it's, specifically when it comes to drivers and GPUs, this is why the latest NVIDIA drivers being so poorly written and causing blue screens and crashes and all sorts of other things. Make sure your drivers are up to date. But I also would maybe do some research to determine whether or not you should hold off a little bit before you update. But specifically if you're playing the newest titles that are out, almost definitely are you required to update your graphics driver. Otherwise, the game may not even load. You may get a message that pops up and says, error, you are not running the correct driver to run this game. Please update the latest driver. Then unfortunately, you might update your system with a bunch of issues because NVIDIA seems to not be able to write a proper driver these days. So you might be causing yourself some performance. If you're running an older title with a new graphics card, there's just, drivers is a whole fun video to talk about all by itself. But making sure your drivers are up to date is also the best way to make sure that your graphics card is running the way that it's supposed to. Theoretically, if the driver is not complete trash, like NVIDIA has been giving us for about 6 months now. So AMD though, it's actually been pretty solid. Isn't it funny how the turntables, you know? All right, we got an honorable mention here when we talk about GPUs before we move on to the biggest honorable mention. And that is to also make sure that your monitor, if it's a high refresh rate monitor, meaning it goes above 60 FPS or 60 Hertz, make sure that's turned on. Like, it is crazy the amount of people that still post on Reddit that they didn't even realize their monitor was not set to high refresh rate. Now that also tells me they've probably never seen anything high refresh rate, or you would have noticed it immediately, unless you're like Nick, who literally does not notice anything above 60 FPS. Go ahead and cue all the human eyeball cannot see above XYZ FPS anyway, and we can tell you how you're wrong, but that's fine. Hopefully I just triggered some arguments down there. Fight. Okay, now the last thing we're gonna talk about here, this is more an advanced thing. This is not so much, I think, a beginner thing, but we're gonna talk about virtualization-based security, or VBS as it's known. VBS is something that became huge when we talked about the Spectre and Meltdown exploits and vulnerabilities when it came to Intel CPUs, and it was great because AMD was like, haha, sucks to be you. And then the vulnerabilities were found on AMD, and Intel's like, oh, what were you saying? It was actually affecting all CPUs going back generations of CPUs. And this exploit was actually around for a long time, especially when it comes to Spectre and Meltdown. But virtualization-based security, I'm not gonna go into a super deep dive on this, even though I have a lot of notes in front of me right now. Basically, it protects against credential theft and reuse, kernel exploits, malicious drivers, low-level boot malware. Now, low-level boot malware would be like an example of like ransomware, right? You go to turn on your system, suddenly you have a red screen that's saying, we've taken control of your system. To get it back, you need to send us this much money. Now, although I've seen individual users kind of get hit by that, they tend to target like big enterprises or big businesses. I think I think not that long ago, a bank was actually hit with that. I think even the US government was hit with it once. So it becomes valuable to exploiters that are going to hit that when you shut down an entire infrastructure of something, because then it becomes very important to get that back up and running as fast as possible. So that's why it's not that big of an issue for most people just using a gaming system. And the last but not least, it stops privilege escalation through memory tampering. Now, VBS specifically targets and protects the memory, because all of these attacks happen in memory, but turning it off, before you start flaming me saying, why would you ever turn it off? I just want to say, turning it off can lead to as much as 5% or more FPS increase in your system, simply because the CPU is so busy with the virtualized or the VBS that it actually does impact gaming performance. Now, I would not recommend turning it off if you have a shared system, you're doing online shopping, you're doing online banking, you're going to websites that require that you put in your birth date. I think you know what I'm talking about. Or any sort of peer-to-peer. If you're sharing data information anywhere, the only person I think that would be quote unquote safe, if you will, is the person that goes, my system does nothing but play games. I turn it on, I play my games. You might even have it directly booting into big picture mode in Steam, and then that's it. No one else touches it, no one else uses it. But if the person is like, I want every single freaking FPS I paid for, you're never gonna get it with VBS on. Now, this is not a discussion about whether or not you should turn VBS off. It's just a mention of, recently we found out when it comes to like the world record attempts and stuff, that having VBS off is the only way to ever get the absolute maximum performance out of your GPU. So it's one of those things, if you wanna play around with like XOC overclocking and stuff, you turn it off, you do it in Windows. You turn it off, you mess around with your overclocks and all that, and then when you're done, you turn it back on. Now, the only way you would actually be kind of exposed to any of these type of malware or malicious attacks that would circumvent like VBS being able to stop it by turning it off would be people going to online websites and such where information is being sent back and forth. Like banking is a perfect example. Banking is one of the #1 ways people were using malware, was to be able to keylog and be able to know your banking credentials and get access to that sort of stuff. But it was just a mention here to say, if you're trying to get the absolute max performance out of your system, VBS is giving you a hit. Now, I plan on kind of doing a video just to sort of measure before and after VBS, just to see what that hit is, depending on the type of title. Some titles see bigger hits than others. 3D Mark is one that actually sees a pretty big hit, but a lot of titles see no hit at all. So it's really not recommended to turn that off. But if you're gonna turn it off and play around with the before and after, make sure you turn it back on, because the last thing you want to do is find yourself in a situation where you wish you'd never turned it off. So it's only mentioned to say, it's there, this is what it does, and I don't recommend really messing with it. But anyway, I wanna know now, what are your guys' #1 ways to try to get the most performance out of your system? One thing we didn't even talk about was having third-party antivirus software. Almost all third-party antivirus software is a complete waste of money and resources on your system. In fact, Windows Defender is about the best that you could have on your system these days. And the days of Avast and all of that being the best is no longer the case. They're almost all full of bloat. They're almost all full of ads, because they're trying to nickel and dime the crap out of you on the type of performance and the type of scanning that they do. Hey, do you want us to scan every single packet that comes into your system? Do you want us to scan every single packet you send? Hey, do you want our built-in VPN? Hey, do you want us to check every email? Hey, do you want us to check every and the thing is, every time it does that, it really starts to hit your systems. And the problem is, they're just don't seem to be very good at their jobs anymore. All right, guys, sound off down below what your #1 ways of making sure that you're not robbing your system of free performance, and maybe we'll pin the best one. All right, guys, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.